As this, you drastically reduce the effort you need to cut the soil. At the same time as the ploughshare cuts the earth, the mouldboard turns the soil in the air. Now, if that seems obvious, that's because every great idea seems obvious in retrospect, but it wasn't obvious to anyone outside China.
Cast iron allowed the Chinese to mass-produce farm equipment like this, quickly and easily, but it was far from perfect. The high content of carbon in cast iron makes the metal fairly brittle, so the ancient Chinese created a metal with more resilience: steel.
This is a 21st century blast furnace. It's called a blast furnace because there's a machine, like a giant hot air dryer, that blows air in from the top. The more oxygen in the furnace, the higher the temperature, the less carbon in the mix, the different properties of steel at the end. And while this system here is completely automated and computerized, the basic principles, this wonderful alchemy of carbon, iron and oxygen, were known to the Chinese over 2,000 years ago.
Around the 2nd century BC, the Chinese realized you could produce steel cheaply by blowing air into molten cast iron. To generate a regulated and constant stream of air, they invented the double-action piston bellows. Here's how it worked. It's equipped with dual intake valves. As you push a piston in, compressed air on one side of the bellows closes the chamber's valve and forces the air out through the bottom. Meanwhile, the other valve opens as pulling sucks air into its chamber. Pushing and pulling creates a continuous flow of air, the genesis of the blast furnace. The Chinese needed plenty of energy to keep their furnaces hot, but combining oxygen with the iron's carbon fueled a chemical reaction that helped heat the mixture naturally. Eventually, it was this technique that made it possible to mass-produce inexpensive steel.
Steel is the backbone of modernity. Without steel, there's no airplanes, no automobiles, no railroads. The invention, the discovery of mass-produced steel was nothing less than a revolution.
Industry was one reason the imperial city of Kaifeng flourished. People flocked here in search of work. Of the more than 100 million people that lived in China at the time, 1 million lived here. But as the Song Empire grew, so did the need to protect its borders. In Qingming Park, tourists can experience their history during that period. It is here at the firing range that I find simplified replicas of the deadly weaponry used to defend the thriving Song Empire.
For over 2,000 years, this was a standard issue weapon in the Chinese arsenal. It is, of course, a crossbow, and it is yet another Chinese invention. Now, in an age of assault weapons and machine guns, we might be inclined to underestimate the crossbow, but it represented a huge improvement on anything that had gone before. A standard bow is ultimately limited by the strength in the archer's arm. But with this, you can store the tension in this bow and release it when you please with a trigger. This is a very crude mechanism of a crossbow, but we know that by the 3rd century BC, the Chinese were making these to a quite extraordinary degree of precision, with bronze trigger mechanisms with 3 moving parts.
The trigger worked like this. A warrior could pull back the bowstring using the weight of his body and store all that tension by sliding the string behind 2 hooks. Pulling the trigger released the hooks and sent the bolt flying. It was crucial that the bronze trigger was precise. They said that if the trigger was off by the width of a grain of rice, it wouldn't work. By the middle of the Song dynasty, during the 11th century, the Chinese had developed the machine gun of crossbows.
This crossbow is a repeating crossbow. It has a magazine up here with multiple bolts or darts, so you can fire many within several seconds. Now, the drawback of the repeater is there's a trade-off. You lose something in accuracy, but you can put many more darts in the air at any one time. With a couple of these, you'd give any attacker pause for thought.
The Chinese kept the crossbow a carefully guarded military secret. In 200 BC, There was even a law against taking one out of China to prevent enemies from copying the design. This lethal Chinese invention would not be surpassed until the age of the firearm. China's technological innovations remained hidden from the world for centuries, concealed by linguistic and geographic barriers. But the Chinese developed technology to breach these barriers and explore the world beyond.
For the greater part of the history of sailing, the technology of Chinese sailboats has been drastically superior to anything that any Westerner had. Much of that superiority lay in the sails. This is called a batten sail. The battens are the strips of bamboo, and the advantage of them is that they give mariners great flexibility. If the wind is strong, they can only raise 1 or 2 battens. If the wind is weak, they can raise them all.
The parallel battens keep the sail from billowing out too far and losing thrust. Another revolutionary innovation was aligning pivoting sails along the axis of the boat, so they could catch the wind from different directions.
In the west, sails tended to be at right angles with the boat, and that meant they could only sail properly when the wind was behind them. But with this, you could sail with the wind in 3 quarters. If it looks familiar, that's because every modern Western yacht you've seen has copied this design.
The West borrowed other Chinese maritime innovations: rudders to steer ships, leeboards to reduce downwind drift, and watertight compartments to keep boats afloat, even if the hull was breached. Not only did these improvements save lives and make sailing a reliable form of transportation, but they were all well developed by the 2nd century AD. Western sailing technology didn't catch up for another 1,300 years. However, it was an invention made on land that really expanded China's sailing horizons. Chinese officials in court rituals faced the emperor just as the other stars faced the North Star. So they built their imperial palaces with the throne room facing south. From the palace to the sprawling empire at its feet, imperial cities like Kaifeng were built on a precise north-south axis. The ancient Chinese invented something to guide them in finding north-south lines: the magnetic compass.
Originally, compasses pointed not north, but south, and the original compasses looked like this. By the 4th century BC, Chinese alchemists had discovered the properties of lodestone, a naturally occurring magnetic material which, if left free to spin, would align itself with the Earth's magnetic field.
These early compasses were called south pointers because the spoon-shaped lodestone always pointed south.
Many of the earliest uses were largely astrological. Diviners would use the south pointer to find an auspicious spot for a divination or a burial. Town planners would use the lodestone to find a north-south axis for imperial cities, such as this one.
Compasses were used exclusively on land until the middle of the Song dynasty, when the Chinese began exploring the world by sea. Chinese sailors found the compass indispensable on water. By the 12th century, large fleets of Chinese junks were roaming the earth, sailing as far as Africa.
Before it could be used on a ship, the south pointer needed a little finessing. It'll work fine on a perfectly calm day, but with a little wind or a little bucking of the deck, it'll swing around wildly and it's next to useless. Now, at some point, someone figured out that you can use a lodestone to magnetize a plain, ordinary piece of iron. If you take an iron needle, rub it with a magnet, it will behave